Peter Scully is an Australian national and career criminal who will spend the rest of his life in jail in the Philippines due to committing some of the worst, most depraved, sexually motivated crimes against children the country and the world has ever seen. He is a man without remorse, a monster who abused and tortured children for his own sick sexual pleasure. He filmed and sold videos of his horrific crimes for his own profit. The things this man did almost defy belief. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Peter Gerard Scully was born on the 13th of January 1963 in Melbourne, Australia. I've not been able to find any real information about Scully's childhood or upbringing, but outwardly he appears to have lived an ordinary life to a point. Clearly he was an expert at wearing masks during his life. Scully married and had 2 children, and the family lived in Naree Warren, a suburb of Melbourne. It's not clear when, but Scully left the family home to move into central Melbourne, no doubt to give him space to carry out his criminal endeavours. This included fraud on a large scale, with him being the co-director of at least 2 companies. Outwardly, these were property developers, which obtained $2.68 million in funding to build properties in the city of Ballarat, Victoria. However, there were no properties built, and the money was simply siphoned off. The fraud occurred between around 2004 and 2006, and when the companies eventually folded, they owed approximately $4 million to creditors. The Australian Securities and Investments Commission undertook an investigation in 2009 and found that Scully had committed 117 separate offences of fraud and deception. However, in 2011, before he could be arrested, Scully fled to Manila, the capital of the Philippines. Real estate fraud was not Scully's only criminal enterprise in Australia. He'd also gone to Malaysia and travelled back with a teenage, quote, girlfriend called Ling, although some articles state she was from the Philippines, who would then pimp out to individual clients and forced to attend sex parties. A witness recalled Scully locking a completely naked Ling out of their apartment in the middle of the night, apparently as some form of punishment. An associate of Scully's stated, quote, Peter is driven by one thing, money, and it's clear that this is the case, and it's necessary to highlight this point front and centre in order to understand what came next. Scully was clearly a career criminal and a con man, and these individuals often have no empathy for their victims. They see them as a way to make gain for themselves. It seems Scully focused on 2 areas he knew would reap the most rewards, promises of massive gains from property developments and sex, with him willing to use and abuse anyone in any way in order to exploit these opportunities to make as much money as possible. Scully eventually set himself up on the island of Mindanao, living in the city of Cagayan de Oro, and it's here that he began to set up his international child sex abuse ring. Peter Scully is clearly a man who looked for opportunities to make money any way he could, and unfortunately, the Philippines is a notorious place for sex tourists, with many families living in abject poverty, a prime target for paedophiles, who will offer money to elevate the family in exchange for use of their children. In addition, there are an estimated 250,000, quote, street kids in the Philippines who spend their days begging and doing odd jobs in order to buy food. Out of these, around 75% are thought to have families they live with, but 25%, so around 62,000, have no families, no one looking out for them. They live and sleep on the streets, making them a natural target for predators. Unfortunately, the Philippines has become one of the global epicenters for the production and distribution of child pornography due to the ease with which paedophiles can gain access to victims and offend without real fear of being caught. Peter Scully became one of these men, and he set up a dark web child pornography website called, quote, No Limits Fun, as a way to distribute the material he filmed to paedophiles around the world. The material that Scully filmed was what is known as, quote, hurtcore pornography, which is a topic that I've touched on before. This material is the worst end of the scale of child pornography, as it not only depicts acts of sexual violence against children, but it specifically tends to include their torture, with the victims often being extremely young, sometimes babies, with the whole point being to cause the victim as much emotional and physical harm as possible. As well as creating this material to sell, Scully would livestream himself raping and abusing children, taking requests of acts he should perform from his sick website members. Scully would seek out victims on his own, but he also had accomplices who would help him find children to horrifically abuse. There are two main ones I want to mention, Lizelle Margolo and Carmen Ann Alvarez, both of whom were about 17 years old when they met Scully, and it appears they themselves have been the victims of sex trafficking. Scully is known to have raped and tortured at least 8 children, but some reports state that the true number may be in the 60s. His most horrific crimes occurred in 2012 when he made a series of short films called, quote, Daisy's Destruction, which have become an urban legend and are considered, by those who've seen it, the worst child sex abuse material ever created. It's material that sickened even the most seasoned investigators and led to many of them suffering PTSD just from viewing it. Please know that all the child victims' names are pseudonyms. Even if I come across their real names, I would not use them. The Daisy's Destruction films depict 3 victims, who were Daisy, then aged 18 months old, Liza, aged 12, and Cindy, aged 11. In these videos, the children are raped and tortured. The most horrific behaviour is reserved for Daisy, who is filmed hung upside down, where she is beaten, burnt, and tortured, including being burnt with hot wax, all while screaming for help. Lizelle Margolo is seen wearing a mask in these videos, inflicting horrific physical abuse on the children. The title card on one of the parts, which specifically focuses on the abuse of Daisy, apparently reads, quote, Come see a child's mental ruin, her innocence lost, used as a tool. She'll learn to please her mistress. Her body will be ravaged, her dignity stolen. Later, the police would track down Daisy, who had suffered severe physical and emotional damage as a result of her abuse as a baby, as well as Liza, who was also similarly destroyed by the experience. However, the child known as Cindy could not be found. Margolo later told authorities that Scully had filmed himself in a separate video with Cindy, who, remember, was aged just 11 years old, and, after raping and torturing her, forced her to dig her own grave before strangling her with a rope. Her remains were later found buried underneath the property used by Scully. Police inquiries found that both Liza and Cindy had been given up by their parents into Scully's care, with the promise of food and a decent education. In the case of Cindy, her mother had died in 2012, and Margolo offered to adopt the child, telling them that she knew a man who could give her a decent future. Instead, this child was delivered into the hands of the devil, who abused and murdered her. Scully would sell these movies online. In the case of Daisy's Destruction, he would apparently sell this for $10,000. Scully raped and tortured other children, including a 5-year-old, and both Lizelle Margolo and Carmen Alvarez were involved in the abuse of these children, specifically their torture. In September 2014, Carmen Alvarez was tasked by Scully with finding him more children to abuse. Here is her speaking in her own words.
He said to me, can we adopt some street kids? And I said, I don't know, I don't think so. What if my sister to live with us? He said to me, no, I don't want your sister, I want a street kid to help them. Then I meet these 2 kids. Then I said to these kids, you want to come with me? And then the kids say, yes.
So you asked them to come home with you?
Yeah.
Because Peter wanted 2 girls?
Yeah.
And did he tell you what age he wanted?
He said he wants 9 and 12.
The 2 girls that Alvarez is talking about were 11-year-old Daisy and her 10-year-old cousin Queenie, who were hungry and hanging around a local shopping centre. After having a meal, she invited them back to Scully's property with the promise of food and shelter. Over the next 5 days, the children were raped and tortured by Scully, who forced them to dig their own graves, with him threatening that, if they tried to escape, they'd be murdered and placed in the holes. They were chained up and forced to wear dog collars, and each day they were taken back to the holes to dig a bit deeper, to reinforce to them the consequences of defiance. On one occasion, one of the children woke up in the hole she had dug, and she was told she'd been placed there as she'd been making too much noise and she was crying for her mother. One of the children later said, quote, "I wanted to kill myself. I wanted to die that night because I could not bear it any longer." On the 5th day, Alvarez released the girls, apparently feeling remorse for her role in Scully's crimes, although, in other reports I've read, it stated that the children simply found a way to escape on their own. However, regardless, these 2 children were able to escape and raise the alarm, telling the police what had happened to them. This led to Alvarez being arrested almost immediately, but Peter Scully and Lizelle Margolo went on the run. On the 20th of February 2015, Peter Scully was tracked down to Balay City in the Philippines and arrested on charges related to the rape and torture of the 2 cousins in September 2014. However, Lizelle Margolo was nowhere to be found, and she would evade authorities for 2 years. She spent this time apparently living in luxury, using the false name Shannon Carpio, with her presenting herself as the wife of a French software millionaire. She lived in a palatial condominium in the affluent Cebu City. Instead of keeping her head down, she could not help but show off her life, posting vain pictures of herself in revealing clothes online. Margolo would spend lavishly, spending money on designer clothes and luxury meals, telling her friends the money came from her rich husband. Instead, it's believed that she continued to organise the rape of more children, recruiting others to commit these offences, filming these acts, and selling them online, possibly at the direction of Scully from prison. How she was eventually caught is unclear, but after 2 years on the run, Margolo was arrested and sent to prison to await her fate. Initially, Peter Scully was charged with 6 offences, which included 1 count of human trafficking and 5 counts of rape, charges he denied. However, he was convicted. On the 13th of June 2018, Peter Scully appeared before Judge Jose Escobedo, who sentenced him to life in prison. The judge also sentenced his accomplice, Carmen Alvarez, to life imprisonment. However, it took the combined effort of several law enforcement agencies to reveal the true scale of Scully's offending. Filipino authorities, Dutch police, and the Australian Federal Police all worked together to identify the victims of Scully's offending, identify him and his accomplices. Part of this involved looking at details which were filmed in order to link them to locations where the abuse had occurred and subsequently to Scully, but this took some time, so it wasn't until 2022 that he answered for the other 60 charges which had now been brought against him, including multiple counts of child abuse, human trafficking, rape, and syndicating child pornography. Unfortunately, I've had difficulty confirming whether Scully was charged with the murder of Cindy, the poor 11-year-old girl whose remains were found buried under a property linked to him. Some reports say he was, some don't mention it. However, in subsequent interviews, Scully appears to confirm that he did kill this child. This is more related to him not denying this fact, rather than outwardly expressing his guilt. On the 3rd of November 2022, at Cagayan de Oro Court, Peter Scully was convicted and sentenced to 129 years in prison. Also stood next to him was Lizelle Margolo, who had swapped her designer threads for prison clothes. She was sentenced to 126 years in prison for her part in Scully's crimes. Peter Scully was lucky to escape with his life, as the horrific nature of his crimes led to public outcry and the prosecutors pushed for the death penalty, which had not been used since 2006, to be brought back just for him. From what I can see, Peter Scully, who is now 60 years old, is incarcerated at Cagayan de Oro City Jail, where he's complained about the conditions. Oh, bless him. And he will inevitably spend the rest of his miserable life behind bars. Before speaking about Peter Scully, I want to introduce some clips from an interview with him in 2015.
So when you were on the run, how great was the urge?
Urge for what?
To find young girls.
Hardly ever had an urge. It's not like a hungry dog that's got to feed every 3 hours or 4 hours. It's not like that. And it's really not. It's almost not an urge.
Then why do it?
Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Why would you abuse an 18-month-old child?
Well, for a start, I didn't. And
Well, that's not true, is it?
It is true. No, I'm sorry, you're
Oh,
wrong.
I'm sorry. How old was she?
Huh?
How old was she, Peter?
You are confusing different things. I don't want to get into that.
How old was she?
Huh?
How old was she?
I don't want to get into any of that yet.
Right, okay. Whether that child was 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, or perhaps we're mixing it up with a 9-year-old child or an 11-year-old girl, 12-year-old girl. You've done it to all of them, haven't you?
All right, I will go back to this now. No comment.
What is it about you, Peter, that hates children and women so much?
I might address that in the journal.
It just got crazier and crazier for you and sicker, and you'd already committed murder. Where was it going to end? Like, what was the next level for you?
There was no next level.
And as a parent, how can you reconcile what you've done to children?
Next question, please.
Do you accept that you were ruining their lives as soon as you came in touch with them?
In the journal.
So you really have no sympathy for these people, for these kids?
That is definitely in the journal. I think we are finished.
I think we are.
Okay.
He can get up. Get up, please.
To clarify, Scully mentions a journal, and this is related to him stating, at the time, that he was going to write a tell-all manuscript about his crimes and his feelings around his offending. This is a cowardly move, with him just trying to kick the can down the road when asked specific questions, stating that the answers will come, but not yet, and only on his terms. I imagine this journal would not be free either, and so, again, Scully was looking for an angle to make some money. Whether he ever wrote this journal is unclear. These clips are so interesting, as you can tell the coldness and lack of empathy of Peter Scully. He couldn't even admit, despite what he'd done, which appears to include murder, that he'd ruined these innocent children's lives. I find it particularly disturbing when he says he never molested an 18-month-old, given that he filmed himself doing this. He's clearly trying to argue the age, stating that she was older, and somehow this makes a difference. I like the interviewer pushing back and stating that, was she 2, 3 years old? Pointing out how little difference this makes to the horror that he put this and other children through. I do love Australians. They can be so scathing without raising their voice, and I love the bit at the end where the interviewer tells Scully to stand up and waits for the guards to take him back to the hole he crawled out of. I understand what the interviewer was trying to do, get Scully to express some level of remorse for his crimes. I think remorse is a somewhat overrated concept after a certain point. Yes, I think you can have someone who has hurt or killed someone in a moment of anger, and then, when the red mist dissipates, they can feel remorse and regret for their actions. But someone who systematically raped and tortured multiple children, and I've no doubt murdered at least one, is clearly a person who doesn't feel remorse, or empathy, or compassion. Otherwise they would not be able to do these things. Even if Peter Scully turned round and said, yes, I have remorse, given the gravity of his crimes, what real difference does such a statement make? Does it make up for the emotional, psychological, and physical destruction he caused? The innocence he took from these extremely vulnerable children? Peter Scully was a man driven by power and his own gratification. In Australia, this came from robbing people of their hard-earned money. I imagine he likely took great pleasure in living the high life and revelling in other people's misery, indicating his sadistic tendencies. I've no doubt that Peter Scully had researched his next project in the Philippines and was putting the pieces in place before he fled there. When he got there, he realised he could exert ultimate power over others through sexual violence, torture, and murder, whilst also making a profit. The children whose bodies he broke were merely objects he could use to live out his sadistic sexual fantasies and get rich from. They were disposable. I have no doubt that Scully is a sadistic psychopath, a man without remorse, and who, if released tomorrow, would go straight back to what he was doing. This man is truly evil, and is clearly one of the most dangerous child sex offenders of modern times. I'll also briefly mention his accomplice, Lizelle Margolo, clearly a sick, sadistic, psychopathic woman who clearly enjoyed abusing these children and living the high life off their misery. I think her current prison surroundings are more reflective of her true standing in life. So, what are your thoughts on the case of Peter Scully? If anyone has information on his upbringing or the sort of man he was, then please share it with all of us. Please like, share and subscribe, and I want to thank you for watching and your ongoing support. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.